Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our webinar today, Built to Last, how we can apply risk management to HR program design and delivery. I'm Ken Matos, Director of Market Insights here at HiBob, and I am joined by my esteemed colleague and very good friend, Jeannie Donaghy. Jeannie, if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. So as Ken said, I'm Jeannie Donaghy. I had our professional services group in the Americas and our emerging markets. We are responsible for anybody who does join us at HiBob, helping you realize that value and implement your Bob system. And in my previous life, I was actually on your side of the table. So my past life, I was internal HR and implemented many systems during that lifespan as well.
So Jeannie and I have known each other for many years and worked with a number of customers and organizations working on building programs and trying to make sure that those programs survive disruptions and change. We're in a moment in time when everything feels like all of your assumptions are wrong. And whatever you thought was going to happen isn't what happened. And so, how do we think about the creation of the programs that we're creating, the services that we're delivering, and making sure that they are enduring in these moments of disruption? So, that's going to be our conversation today. And so, we hope you get a lot of value out of that. Before we go any further, I would like to ask you all to complete a quick poll that is part of our data gathering. So you'll see that on your screen, and we'll keep going from there. So one phrase that always pops in my mind with these kinds of conversations, Jeannie, is no plan survives contact with the enemy. It's old German military strategist who pointed out this reality. And when I think about it for us, it becomes no plan survives contact with our employees. It, so often it's really clear planning and it just somehow doesn't work. I mean,
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think this is true whether it's an L&D program rolling out. We talk about this when people are implementing Bob all the time of people are going to touch buttons that you never even imagined that they were going to push. So you have to think through all those scenarios.
yeah. And so there's really no easy way to say, okay, we've got it all planned, it's going to go perfectly. So at the end of the day, the only change is the only thing we can really reliably plan for. And there's a lot of different changes that can happen. Things like lack of executive buy-in, budget cuts, shifting priorities, low employee engagement or adoption of your programs. You might have the leadership buy-in and then lose it when they go. And sometimes you just find that you built this thing and it doesn't really align with your business strategy anymore. Um, the thing that really strikes me about a lot of these conversations is that people talk about these things, the big changes that sort of disrupted expectations. You can't really control them. Like, I mean, gee, have you ever been able to say, no, boss, you're not leaving. You're going to stay, continue funding my project?
All the time, Ken. No?
I clearly am not aggressive enough with my leaders, but you kind of can. But what you
Yeah.
can do is plan for how you're going to respond to it. And when we don't plan for that, that's where we really see the things that cause failure. It isn't that the leader left or that the budget got changed. It's that we had to respond in a crisis moment and couldn't think clearly. We didn't communicate with enough people. The program we built was too rigid, and so it couldn't adapt when things changed and just ended up dying. Or we just didn't take any time past implementing it to think about what happens on day two. Have you seen that with customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I'm a sucker for a good quote and also a good analogy, so I'll tie those in where I can here. But I think my favorite expression that is just tried and true and really comes to life is you have to go slow to go fast. And my customers that I see that are most successful, when I've been most successful in my past, is making sure that I'm really thinking through where can I anticipate those bends around the corner. I'll share too one of my favorite analogies that a former boss used when it comes to communication is people can smell the cookies cooking in the oven. Even if you don't tell the cookies are there, they can smell them. So if you don't say who are the cookies for, what type of cookies are they, when are they going to be done, everybody in the organization is going to make up their own stories. And before you know it, the cookies are only going to the CEO and they're the best cookies you've ever had in your life. So you need to make sure that you're sharing that information even if it's just, hey, we've got cookies in the oven, we're going to tell you more when we know more. So I'm sure we're going to go into a lot of these in more details, but a couple of things that popped to mind here.
Absolutely. I've definitely talked with people who were saying who had exactly what everyone wanted, but because they didn't tell them that that's what they were building, they
Yeah,
panicked, had a freak out, and suddenly they had 20 more things to manage rather than actually getting people what they wanted. It was an insane moment.
yeah, absolutely.
So when I said, like, hey, we're in this big moment, everybody's struggling with it. How do we create some frameworks to empower us to deal with it more effectively? My attention really gravitated towards risk management. And so HR already does risk management. We work with the risk management team, but we often don't think about it and apply it to us and what we're working on. We're so busy fulfilling other people's expectations, getting their tasks done, that we don't really stop and say, like, I'm putting a lot of effort into this. How do I make sure it survives when I move on to something else? And really trying to think about how do you minimize the impact of foreseeable changes, prepare like some contingency plans, and just maintain credibility. Because like half the time, if people just stay on board, you can steer them in the right direction. It's when they all start running around in the ship pit because they've all decided to go to the bow, you've got some challenges.
Yeah, I think the other balance here, Ken, is really I consider myself a recovered perfectionist. And in my earlier career days, I definitely felt like risk management was going into every single level of detail that I could think about, writing out all of the specifics so that it would be perfect. And the big theme that I've seen here, as well as what we'll talk about through the rest of the presentation, is that adaptability, right? The rigidity is what's going to kill the projects. So being able to, as much as you can, anticipate, okay, like I should let off the gas a little because I'm about to go around a curve. But also know, okay, if this road's closed, I can go around in a different direction and change my my path really quickly so that you're still successful and you're not caught like a deer in the headlights.
That's so true because like I've been having a lot of conversations about being agile organization and like what does that mean? And for so many people, they think about it in terms of how fast can I move and nothing else. And so they go super fast, they cross the finish line, and then they're like, "Oh, I ran a different race than I actually wanted to be in." And you're like, "Oh, well, you got there fastest." So it doesn't matter if you're first if you actually are running the wrong race. And I think that's where risk management thinking can really help. So, and to your point, there's so many things. HR is such a universe of places where people dump perspectives and questions and challenges, and HR people are so willing to like pick up the challenge and run with it that you end up with just a universe that you can't really manage. It just becomes too much. And so I really like this framework of sort of bucketing everything into one of three big perspectives. Either it's a project risk where you're talking about the initiative not launching or not being in budget or all those just basic plans of how does it run, one of those pieces breaking. Or it's a strategic risk. The program's going to execute just fine, but nobody cares about it because it was for when we were in Germany and now we're in Switzerland and it's a different country. So just that program is no longer aligned versus like operational risks. So staffing or reducing limitations. So you have a program, everybody thinks it's worth doing, but they need to move the staff from project A to project B because project B needs to hit the market faster. And then suddenly your first thing that everyone still says is valuable isn't getting what it needs to survive. And so I find that to be a framework that just how to bucket everything and not feel like there's an infinite array of possibilities. Did did this resonate with any of the kinds of experiences that you've had talking to people about what could go wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I love a good framework. I like my brain being able to put things sort of in folders so that I can digest them and then also proactively lean into where do I need to think through the aspects, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit. I know we also have the chat open. I would love to hear from folks too. Where do you see this popping up? Which do you see as most common for where you've had problems in the past? So we'll get some engagement going over there as well.
So examples of project risks range from underestimating how long it'll take to configure the new LMS, or the cross-functional team member you focused on just didn't stick around. They got pulled into a competing project, or a third-party vendor changes their fees, and so suddenly the plan that was built very closely to budget has just sort of exploded past. Jeannie, I know you work with a lot of customers who plan projects, rollouts. What kind of experiences have you had in terms of project risks?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where, again, you can't anticipate everything, right? So if something is popping up that you didn't expect, somebody takes a longer vacation, right? Or somebody's been hurt and they're not in the business, so you don't have that resource. How do you shift things around? I would say project risk probably overlaps most also with operational risk, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But project risk is where I see folks not taking enough thought into, okay, how much time is this going to take? What do I need to think about from the day to day? And where can I fit this in to make sure it's prioritized? Because I think it's like a New Year's resolution, right? Like you come into the new year, you're all excited with all this energy, and then before you know it, it's June and you're like, well, it's been 6 months. Like, do I even have the time? Is this even important anymore? So making sure how can you plan those pieces out so that you think about, okay, where can we adjust things? Where can I make sure that I'm deprioritizing something else? Or again, with the recovering perfectionist part, where can I think about the 80% being good enough and not worry about getting to the perfectionist part?
So it when once we've sort of thought about those things, we can be considering strategic risks. And so those are things like, have you designed a performance management system that really aligns to where leadership is going to be and what they're going to be asking you to prove? Um, your DEIB initiatives, like, has the company merged with another organization, and which sort of throws the whole premise of how you structured the cultural norms and priorities there in the air. Or return to office has been a really big place where people spent a lot of time and effort creating remote work for COVID and post-COVID as a value proposition. And then suddenly their leaders are like, nope, everybody back in the office. What do I do with that? Have you been seeing that with some of our customers and organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a big one where, maybe you've purchased a program or an LMS, or you've rolled out an L&D initiative, and again, to your point, something shifts. And I often think of this one as how strong is your storytelling, right? If you turn on the 10 o'clock news, you shift the data a certain way that broccoli causes cancer, right? So how can you make sure that you're in tune with what the strategy of the organization is so that you can pivot that conversation to make it align with whatever those changing goals are? How do you have your stakeholders understand, no, actually, this isn't irrelevant. It's now relevant in this fashion and ties to this goal so that you don't have to just throw all that hard work out the window.
And then finally, as we were talking about the operational risk, it does have some overlap with project risk. What I really think about is the big distinction is project risk really focuses on how do you get it started. Operational risk is how do you deal with changes to all those base functioning assumptions as you move into the future. And so it's not just, did we get budget this year? It's, are we going to be able to keep budget next year? And are we going to be able to maintain the staffing? We know we're going to have 5 more projects coming. Is this a project we can actually sustain after the fact? Becomes much more the question of operational risk. And so thinking about what you're going to do after you've launched really is where my head goes when I'm talking about the operational risks versus the project risks.
Yeah, I think streamlining, thinking about again the difference between scaling versus or kicking something off versus scaling it in the long term, and how do you make sure that you can continue to use that momentum. One of the big things that we've been looking at internally, and I know every organization's looking at this right now, is how can you use AI to also automate those pieces so we can continue to keep the pieces that we've done and that we love, but then also add more into that so we can continue to evolve and we don't have to leave our little babies that we created before behind.
I love that you're bringing up AI here because I think AI is like one of the ultimate operational risks because so much of the focus in the conversation there is about what can it do for the project? Can it make it faster? Can it like make this easier? But great, now we don't need these 5 people. We got rid of them. Oh, they also have the rest of their jobs. And that's really an operational risk that people are not accounting for. And then we see a lot of stories of organizations being shocked and surprised when they were like, oh, it makes so much strategic sense and the project will run so much smoother if AI does it. Oh, I don't have the staff to do the other 5 things that these people did. And I really think one of the places when you're talking about AI that you want to really focus the most on is this operational risk space, because it's so much more about tomorrow than it is about right now.
Absolutely.
So big picture, what we're looking for when we're trying to manage risks is spotting what the potential risks are early so that we can adjust timelines and expectations, avoid last minute scrambles. Because honestly, it's not change that causes us pain. It's ripping things apart on the fly with people yelling at you that why wasn't this done yesterday? That really causes the stress and anxiety. And the more we're like, yeah, I know what to do in this moment, the less that becomes a painful experience for you or your employees. Because the more energy you have, the more time you have to coach people through their own transformation journey and keep the energy from going toxic. Um, and so really what we're looking for at the end of the day is not making sure nothing ever changes or reacts or adapts, but making those adaptations smoother, cleaner, and less stressful.
Yeah, the again, if I'm going to tie in a picture here or an analogy, Ken, I think about it as the duck swimming on the water, right? You don't want to seem like the duck that or the an animal thrown into the water flailing and trying to swim, but rather, sure, I'm not saying that you're not going to be busy with all of these changes, and once you manage risk, it's going to be a piece of cake, but you'll look like the duck gliding on water, which has the really busy feet underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets you the trust you need to do other things and keep things moving. Um, so we've talked about sort of the big idea. Now it's probably time to start thinking in terms of what can we actually do? So if I'm applying this risk idea and identifying risks, what are some tips on how I actually make this a lived experience in my organization? And so I like to use this sort of 5 point frame in order to sort of checklist myself to make sure I'm addressing each of these issues. And so the first is sort of anticipating change. And so it ties to what we've been sort of talking about of like, what are the risks? But just knowing that what you should be thinking about doesn't really mean you do it. I think one of the most important things in the whole process is carving out time and mental space to really understand what could happen. And so 3 tips that I thought were really useful were scheduling what could change discussion. So one of the things that I find is that a lot of people sort of look at the current moment, they plan everything out for it, and there's no actual moment in the process where you say, could the leader who's sponsoring this leave? What is this budget really reliable, or could it shift? Did I win it through force of personality? Then it's probably something that's really vulnerable to going away. And articulate that for yourself early on in the process, because then you can design things to address it. I think it's also important to track trends. I always say track trends because this is literally my job. I look at what's going on in the market and in the world, but I see so many people feeling shocked and out of sway because they hear one thing and they're sort of running with it. AI is a great example where there's so much that it does, there's so much that it doesn't do. And so when you're keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening, you're better able to anticipate, I see what's going on. A leader's going to show up. Return to office is another really good example. Like the second the big companies started doing return to office, if you wanted to maintain a remote program as a value proposition, really going hard and early to say, why might we change? How can we make sure that this program's delivering value that's meaningful right now? It allows you the time to think and respond before you even get the first question about should we be following the big boys in this shift. And finally, break up your projects. I think one of the things that a lot of people do is try to like launch it all at once. When really they should be doing some phase one, some pilots, minimum viable programs, MVPs, which is just an acronym I always think of very differently. But it gives you the opportunity to stop and like make incremental changes, but also show incremental progress. So it's not like I spent 6 months launching something, it'll take another 6 months to show value. Maybe it takes me 2 months to launch something that shows a little bit of value and I can build on that. And that helps people stay invested and feel like the project is delivering value and meaning long before it gets to its full state.
And I think these are great tips, but I can imagine that some people, and even myself, in looking at this, feels like, okay, well, now I'm taking one project and I'm exponentially increasing the amount of work I need to think about. So, how do you think about anticipating that change and coming up with contingency plans without feeling like you're boiling the ocean and have to have a magic globe that you could see the future in?
Absolutely. And a lot of that comes down to prioritizing and thinking about which of these are the most meaningful risks to consider, as opposed to trying to capture every single thing. And I think what's really most important for this stage of the process is just that you stopped and did it at all. Because I don't
Mm,
think it's so much that people lack the ability to predict the risks or set themselves up. It's that they're moving so fast through the implementation that it just never is part of the conversation. And so that's why the second stage is focused on identifying and prioritizing risks. And so one of the things I think is actually most important is just do a simple little graph where you put the likelihood of a change against its potential impact. Because one thing I find a lot happens is people know something could happen and it could be really big, but it's actually really unlikely. So why are we spending time on this?
right, right.
Or vice versa. It's really likely, but it's so insignificant. Like, yes, Sarah is going to come in and complain, but Sarah complains about everything. She has yet to cause something to collapse. Just plan to deal with her showing up. Don't try to find a way to avoid it. Like, that's not a
Mm,
risk worth investing in. And if you sort of array those on a little graph, you can just sort of visualize like that center bucket that's reasonable likelihood and reasonable impact is where you spend the majority of your time and effort. And then you can sort of look at the stuff on the edges that are um, high impact but low likelihood, and just sort of think about how long will it take for the damage to be done. Things that move really fast, you might want to spend a little bit of time considering. Something that has a big impact is unlikely and slow. You'll figure it out in that moment, but you'll also have told yourself that that's when you're going to figure it out, which makes it a lot more manageable.
yeah, it doesn't come as a surprise then. Caroline had actually posted a question in chat that I think ties to this point really well. With
Mhm.
constraints, instead of doing more with less, should we be promoting to do less with less? So, how would you tie that into prioritization?
100%. I think that's where you sort of, instead of talking about like the risk, you really want to talk about the value. And so if you're doing 20 projects, at some point, you're going to want to say, is this still delivering enough value for the effort being put in? And if I cut this, can I take the energy that I was putting there, sink it into someplace else, and make that even more valuable? And so what I think a lot of organizations, especially in this moment of lean staffing, really need to be doing is talking about whether or not the thing that they're doing is worth it. Uh, and if it's not, back burner it. Maybe it's a beloved program, but is it really worth it because it's stressing everybody out to keep it running? And so when we talk a bit about the business alignment, that's one of the places that you're going to want to really see. And so the one thing I would be careful of is a lot of executives are overachievers by nature. And so talking to them about people being overwhelmed doesn't really click with them. It's like their minds don't accept overwhelm. It's like either something is worth doing or it's not worth doing, and if it's worth doing, you do it. And so really what we want to sort of frame up for them is much more sense of context of these things are worth doing. Are they worth doing now or are they worth doing later? Becomes a question that they can process. Just saying like it's too much is usually something their brains just say, well, rise to the occasion. I am, and can really throw off your flow.
Caroline's got a great follow-up here for you, Ken. Is
Oh,
this where you argue the want, not the need?
yes. Yes. Like I think so much of it is about helping a leader recognize that something is good, but it doesn't keep us functioning. Or this is absolutely something we're going to do in this sequence. I really like roadmaps for this, where you can say, when X happens, it will trigger these next parts of the roadmap and we'll unfold these programs. We've planned them, we've organized them, we'll do some tweaks in the moment, and then it'll unfold. And that way you can compress what you're doing from full program to planning a program that you'll launch when it's actually a good time to launch it. But that at least gives them a little bit of the face save that says, oh yeah, I did have a good idea. Like it was a good idea, but now's not the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other place I've seen this, Ken, is your executives think in terms of numbers a lot, right? Not feelings. So the
Yes.
more you can use data to tie to this. So for example, this program that you love and was your child, I've seen this at a small family owned organization I worked with. Yeah, sure, you loved having two parties a year. That was a big part of our old tradition, but that's costing X amount of dollars. And with those dollars, we could address these three things that are such big um, new initiatives that are going to help with retaining employees, which is we're losing this many employees a year, which is going to help with driving that performance, which we're seeing we're having more safety issues because of, et cetera, and really tying it to the key metrics tied to the business. So that they could see, okay, letting this go will really drive these other components. And yes, it's super hard to tie that ROI to HR. I think HR individuals, a lot of us just are so tightly tied to our integrity and feeling like it needs to be an exact science matching those two things. But that's not always the case. Ken, maybe you can talk us through in a little bit more detail. Where do you see ROI where HR can lean into, for example, some of our sales friends and how they tell stories with numbers?
Absolutely. So honestly, aside from the people who are just literally bringing in direct revenue, almost everybody has to make up a story for what they do creates return on investment. And so what I think always goes kind of wrong is we try to tie what we're doing directly to profit. And that is almost always a losing gambit. What you really want to do is map out how does what you do go through multiple steps to create value at the end of the day. So you were talking about the parties. I think one of the important things is to remember why you started the parties in the first place. And so if you were having a lot of complaints about people saying, I don't know anybody, I don't feel comfortable having conversations, the relationships are weak. Great, we threw some parties. Those complaints have disappeared. People feel like they can have connection. That was the ROI. Like, it wasn't specific money. It was, we were solving a problem that everyone agreed led to money. And so that way you can be like, are we bringing in lots of new people? The parties are probably still serving a purpose. Are we kind of static right now? The parties probably aren't serving that purpose. And unless they serve another purpose, like morale was really bad and we just need something for people to look forward to, maybe you let it go. And so I think a lot of what you want to focus on is, how do you affect your fragment of the line? I like to use what are called line and box models, and they basically trace A causes B, causes B, C causes D, causes profit. And there's a chunk at the end that you either use research or agreed assumption that like everybody knows that once you can affect this, it eventually creates business value. I want to affect the front piece, and that's what I want to measure. So like engagement to show motivation and retention, or conversations with customers becomes a thing that you can connect engagement scores and customer satisfaction scores. That's usually straightforward math. Does customer satisfaction scores create profit? Other people fight that battle. Let them fight that battle. You fight your piece that says, when I have happy customers, when I have happy employees, I have happy customers. That's my battle. And I think a lot of HR people try to own the whole thing rather than identifying what section actually belongs to other business units. Or is stuff that you take from research and training in the outside world and apply as an assumption that justifies the rest of what you're doing. And I think that's kind of what's also really important with tip 2. I think that one's just important to hit on, because you often have people who are pointing out problems or saying it's too much, and they become the naysayer. They're going around popping balloons, and then suddenly no one's really listening to them. They're often right. They might have ideas on how to make things better, but they're only worth listening to if they point out the problem. And so in order to get things through, we really tend to push all the potential feedback down. And so I really like having a planned, deliberate moment to invite all your naysayers in to say, like, what could cause this to fail? What are the problems? Tell me now, so I don't have to fight you about it whack-a-mole style later. And, excuse me, I can recruit you to help me think of the solution. One of the best psychological tricks that I've been taught around dealing with executives is always reframing the objection as, well, what do you think would resolve that? People love to have that opinion. And then once they tell you what they think, you can either use that as a framework to debunk the original complaint, or be like, you're so right. That would be great. Thank you for the funding that you just promised me to do it.
Yeah.
And
Love
so,
that trick, Ken.
yeah. And so when you're talking to your stakeholders and getting them to frame stuff up for you, especially in a formal negative planning moment, you get out of the trap that comes with being the person saying, like, this may not be as wonderful as we think it should be. All of those first 2 steps is really about getting to mitigation planning, which is, okay, what do I do if these things happen? So everyone's talked about the problems. We know what they could be. We've decided which ones are important or not. How do I actually build a mitigation plan? And so for the high priority risks, not every risk, because you've already decided several of them weren't worth paying attention to, just what's one thing you can do right now to make it less likely or less impactful? and what's one thing you'll do after the fact. And so what that allows you to do is say to people, we've already planned for these things, it's built in, and if something else happens, we'll activate these contingency plans. It gives everyone a sense of this process is well designed, because you're talking about broader contextual things. You also want to make sure someone's sort of owning that risk space. And that means just keeping an eye on those trends I talked about before. So if you're launching a workplace flexibility program, keeping an eye out on just, our organizations all going in the opposite direction, to just flag like, hey, we need to really play up the value proposition here, and how being flexible allows us to poach the best talent from those companies that we compete with over the value to employees, because the leader is going to show up and say, well, my buddies over at Chase or wherever are killing their remote work options. Why aren't we? And finally, I like having trigger lists. And this is coming to just some agreement for some of the things that people will panic about. Like, when is it bad enough to react? And so, with the example before of like, all right, Sarah comes up and complains, we're not doing anything differently, because we know that that's going to happen. 3 other managers come up and complain, all right, we need to do some work on convincing people that this was still a good idea. I have another colleague who's like the mistress of this. Like, she owns this thing where she's like, I know exactly how much pushback I need to plan to respond to. She ignores it until it hits that moment, and then she's on it, converting all those naysayers into ambassadors. And so she's really focused on that, because in her culture and organization, it's a bunch of people complaining can take something down. And so she addresses those issues. Focusing on leader buy-in or budgets, not really her problem. It is just the meh that like throws off stuff in her org. And so she's focused on that particular contingency and deals with it very aggressively.
Yeah, I often think of mitigation planning, Ken, as I don't know if anybody's a fan of The Last of Us, but thinking about how do I spread out as much as I can so that I can keep my finger in the pulse in different areas, whether that's networking with people that are in the space so I can hear the chatter that they are hearing, whether it's making sure that I have touch bases and connections with people in other departments so that I can hear what they're hearing on the ground. This way you can really figure out when is it reaching that threshold where, okay, it's time to pay attention. If you only have one data point to look at, that one source where you hear the sky is falling, like you're only looking to Sarah for that advice, then everything is going to seem like it's a really big issue. But how do you make sure that you have multiple data points in a wide web so you can really figure out, okay, when do I need to start actually actioning on this?
This is a great place for having like data trends. Like, I do a lot of talks right now around white collar recession, and everybody being like, "Oh my God, AI has eaten up jobs." And I'm like, "Well, let's actually graph out what's been going on with jobs, and like, are people hiring, not hiring?" And when you put it on a line, you actually see a really clear hiring collapse as a result of COVID. Like,
Mm.
get to the COVID moment, you see the line just plummet to the bottom and slowly come back up. When you go to the spot where AI came into the world, nothing changes. The trajectory of decline started before it and it continued after it. And yeah, AI might be really impactful in your particular industry or space, but the net picture that we were looking at was like, okay, it hasn't broken the world yet. It still might. It still may do a bunch of things. We need to keep an eye on it. But a full shift over to panic mode has not seemed sensible, given the data. There's other reasons why jobs are disappearing. That's where attention should be spent. And so I really find that that can help you decide if it even is a risk or crisis in play, or if it's actually something else entirely. I The next piece I think you talked about really well just a moment ago, Jeannie, which is this idea of communication and alignment. And so there's always the temptation to build something in a vacuum because then you can just put it together, launch it, and then it's done. You don't have 50 stakeholders having opinions and picking it apart, but you kind of need them. If not to be advocates, at least not to be disruptors. And so really beginning to have conversations with them that establish credibility is going to be important. And often you're having those conversations, it's just tweaking what you say a little bit and making sure you add 1 or 2 slides that reference the bigger picture. So I really like just throwing in to a progress update. Here's 2 things we're watching closely and we're prepared to respond to. And so that just lets them know that like you have that bigger picture. Maybe they'll suggest a different thing to watch or something else, but that allows you to assuage any thoughts like, all right, they know what they're doing, they can process this. So when you show up and ask for support or advice, they know that you're in on it. You also want to really make sure that the messaging is matched to the audience. So say you have an L&D program that you're building, and you find that the original vendor is no longer viable. They've deleted that course. Okay, I need to go find somebody else. The executives are going to be like, hey, you're going to go find someone else. How much is that going to cost? The managers are going to say, can I still get my people trained in time to hit my deadlines? Very different risks that they're concerned about, all tied to the same change. And so being able to just flip between those 2 perspectives helps keep them in your corner and moving forward. And then really framing risk as strategy. One of the things I find a lot of people get stuck on is when they talk about limitations or risks, they take it as a failure. Like, I wasn't able to stop this. I wasn't able to block it. The perfectionism you were talking about, Jeannie. When in reality, what you're saying is, I am actually so good. I planned for contingencies that are going to happen or not happen. I can't change gravity, but I can respond to it. And so here's some feedback loops. Here's our plans for flexibility. I've thought about this program in a modular way. So I can sacrifice these pieces, but most of the value comes from this, and that's what we'll protect. And when you can speak in that framework, you come across much more as a leader in charge, and the organization continues to support the initiative.
Yeah, I've read a lot of articles and some books on negotiation tactics. Ken, do you have anything on how overall negotiation ties to this aspect?
I mean, in a weird way, negotiation is everything because so much of our life is just spent persuading people to do things. And sometimes you can do that because you have the authority to just tell them. Sometimes you have to convince them. I think the most important piece of negotiation is always just to understand what somebody else wants and fears. Like, we all look at what's important to us, and I think HR is a really interesting space for caring about the thing that everybody else is like, I kind of care, but I mostly outsource caring about that to you. I'm going to do the thing that I get judged on. And so we have our goals. We are almost never allowed to talk about them. When we're negotiating, talking about what we're actually set to manage almost never gets attention. And it is frustrating and it is sad, but it is a reality that we can adapt to and own, and really being able to flip it to, all right, person I'm talking to, you're a manager, you're terrified that you're not going to be able to hit your goals. How can I have this conversation about the reason you're not hitting your goals is because you scare away your people? And if you could just say hello to them in the morning, you wouldn't have them leave and you would be able to hit your numbers on time, and then you wouldn't be stressed. That is the negotiation you want to give, not, oh, those people are so unhappy and they're leaving and like you're missing your retention number. Like, yes, I know I'm missing my retention number. Like, but I'm also missing the number that decides whether I have a job. And so being able to stop and appreciate them is really important. I think one of the greatest challenges of HR is keeping everyone, both the employees and the managers and the executives, as your charges and not picking one to protect from the others. And
Mm,
it's so much easier to say, I'm here to protect the employees. And that usually ends up just making you as unable to convey their needs as they are. And really being able
yeah.
to say, like, I'm working for all of you, give you so much more negotiating room.
Yeah, absolutely. I find myself often having to straddle this line. Um, I'm sure for HR folks that work with customer success and sales, sometimes it can always feel like they're at odds. So, how do you position the same goal as two different storylines of, hey, sales, I'm here to help you convince folks that we do have something that's going to help them. We want to make sure that we're helping you win these deals because we've seen it work and we can sell the value. And for our side, it's how do we get sales to invite us into the party earlier so that we can set the right expectations, so we can set our customers up for success. It's the ultimate same goal of making sure that we have people that love the system, but the storyline is very different.
Yeah. And things like that also go back to the previous tip around like having that pre-mortem so you can contain all the balloon popping into one meeting rather than having it float around like, oh, if we invite them, they're just going to tell us our idea is stupid. And so, like, let's just not.
Yeah, yeah.
Happens so often. And finally, building resilience into the design. So my goal with all of this is not to create 5,000 more things that you need to do. A lot of this is in the flow of project planning and just thinking about how do I do this? Do you have to do a formal version of everything? No. But like recognizing, hey, at some point we need to think about what could go wrong is really the key. And so when you want to build resilience into design, a couple of tips is like design with iteration or modularity in mind. So you start small, build, don't do the version 10 on day one, it'll collapse under its own weight. Likewise, if you build it incrementally, it's much easier to scale it back because you've scaled it up. If you start
Mhm.
with this gigantic thing, it's usually so integrated that it can't be broken back down when budgets or other constraints appear. Have formal reviews. I talk to so many customers about what I call the in and out rule. They work with an executive who's in on a project, and so they don't need to prove that it's doing value. And so they move forward, they do it, runs for a year, they get a new leader who's like, I don't believe in this. Prove to me it's valuable. Oh, I can't because I've never had to do that before.
Right.
And so having review points after launch is going to be really key. And then finally, document ownership and processes. Who's doing what is something that needs to be written down and like why you did this in the first place, because trusting it to historical memory breaks down when someone leaves. And so you do the party and you don't remember why you do the party, but actually the party is the primary way you create relationships in a highly relationship oriented organization that's distributed. If you don't do the party, no one talks. You forget that, and then you cut it, and then you re-experience the problem. And so
Right.
having that documentation helps you explain as leaders change, or even when you leave and hand it to someone else, they're able to protect your creation.
Yeah, I saw a really great example of this with a customer recently where they had a new CEO come in and it's a big change for the organization. And the CEO decided, you know what, I want to start doing town halls. That's not something we've done before. I want to do it. And obviously, it's a ton of effort and time, right? You're spending how many executives in a room coming up with this strategy? And in order for HR to prove the value, what they went back and did was looked at their engagement survey and you have the question of I understand or I believe in. seniors leadership vision for the company. And they tied that directly to the town hall and did a post survey right after the town hall so they could see the incremental value there. So now when it comes to, oh, it was so much work, it took so much time. Well, look, now everybody believes in where we're going. And that should then, to your point, thinking about that line, reduce attrition and help people stay motivated and tied to the organization.
And so key to that example is they didn't do anything additional. They just adjusted the timeline to maximize a particular goal.
Yeah.
So this is a bunch of tips I hope are valuable and just sort of thinking about how do you set yourself up and your programs to be more enduring. I'd like us to move to having a bit more of a discussion on this and answering any other questions. But it's also a good moment to have our final poll of the session. So if we could get that out there, great. And so let's take a look at the chat and see what other questions we might have.
There was one in there previously, Ken, about tips for cross-country teams.
So I'm assuming that that is a lot about better communication, where people are not bumping into each other, and so organic transfer of information can't be relied on. And so that's where having a really clear cadence of meetings with really clear agendas becomes valuable. And it's the agenda that really matters. Because if you don't have that, then everyone's like, okay, show up. Maybe we talk about something useful. Maybe we don't. I don't feel like this is worthwhile. And so they drift away. And so being able to maintain like this meeting is happening for these reasons. If these reasons aren't worth it, we cancel the meeting. But that allows everyone to say, okay, that meeting is worthwhile. I'm going to attend it because it always has a purpose. And so that really helps resolve a lot of the lack of organic conversation. It's also important to think about, when am I going to tell that person on the far side of the country about the thing that we're doing and why we're doing it? The distributed workforce is itself also a risk factor in terms of, how are we delivering information? How are we coordinating? How are we monitoring or presenting support? All of that goes into that sort of pre-planning moment. And that's why it's so important to have that, because you might come up with the best plan and then someone goes, wait a second, we built it as though everybody's going to come to the office, but like 30% of our workforce can't. We didn't budget for flights. Ooh, what are we going to do? And so I think that's really what's key. A lot of the research suggests that distributed workforces are great, except during the moments when you're trying to get everyone aligned to complex things. Once they're off doing their jobs, they can do it anywhere. But it's those alignment moments that really benefit from in-person contact.
Other questions from the group?
Any other thoughts or questions from you, Jeannie? Like, you and I talk about this all the time, some form or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ken, the thing I would think about here, as we were going through this, I was thinking about one of my most painful failed projects in my HR history, and it was developing a career path for an engineering group. And again, in my perfectionist days while I was developing this, right, and thinking through, okay, for each of these jobs, what do the behaviors for these competencies look like? How does that lead to the next level? And we did a big launch, flights involved, going down, having a launch party, to really get folks excited and adopting this. And 2 months after we launched, they did a reorg. And because we had gone to such fine details on the plan, a lot of what we done became antiquated right away. So, now as I'm thinking about career paths and advising people in those instances, it really comes to that adaptability, which I think you can see thread without this entire presentation, right? Is how do I make sure that in various points, excuse me, I can shift my plan here, so I'm not so rigid in my thought process, that I can go, okay, I'm going to bring that piece in, I'm going to bring this piece in, and we're going to pivot. So again, the final product might not look anything like you thought it was going to in the beginning, but how do you remain flexible and resilient enough that you're happy to get to the outcome that's driving the end of that equation, like you said?
Yeah, I think that's always heartbreaking when you put in that kind of work.
So
But
sad.
I I think part of what happens is we get wrapped up in the thing that gets created and not so much the pieces. Like you need to look at these approaches a little bit more like Legos of like, what can I take apart? Why is this piece here? I think
Good analogy.
yeah, where it seems like I can just rebuild this. So like for a career planning piece like that, what's really helpful is being able to say, all right, what is important to these people in terms of advancement? Do we have particular bands of salary that we're going to link to, regardless of what structure gets created? These are the bands, and so I need to align something to that. What are the learning opportunities? And if you have all that arrayed, it gives you a lot more flexibility. It's part of the reason why organizations are thinking about moving to skills from resumes and job titles, because you can mix and match skills much more freely than you can a whole person or a whole program. And so uh, I would imagine that the more that program that you describe had clear value propositions and interests and skills that went with the spaces, you could have been like, okay, let's now reorg these bits and pieces rather than like, I have this big chunk that now just doesn't fit anywhere.
Yeah, I glued my Legos together, Ken, so I wasn't
Yeah.
able to move anything, but I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah. And sometimes you do. And I think at the end of the day, there's just a need for forgiveness for ourselves. Like
Yeah.
to just recognize there's nothing you could do to have predicted this. I've had so many projects where it's like it was perfect and then literally like the world blew up. And you're like, I did not plan on a pandemic, a remote universe, a return to office universe, a changing
Yeah.
legal landscape. Like all of these things were just assumptions that it made no sense to plan for. And just you had to forgive yourself and move on. And so I think the final message I want people to walk away with is these are all things to help you have more control, to help you address some things proactively, but you're not going to be able to control everything. You're not going to be able to plan for everything. And the act of going through this helps you feel, yeah, I did the work. This isn't a due diligence problem. It's a who the hell thought that meteor was going to hit the Earth for the dinosaurs? Like, and that's
Yeah.
that's really what it is. And new things come from that. But not allowing ourselves to just be fully reactive gives us so much more power, both socially, politically, and professionally.
Very true.
So with that, we are at time. I thank you all for your participation, and we're looking forward to seeing you at future webinars and conversations. Have a great day, everyone.